victims. They don't get to say that. It says that we've failed as a country. Systematic failures, just poor reporting, poor recording. They were just not recording this data. Subscribe for the truth. Subscribe and vote with your feet. Welcome. So the Casey report is out and it's pretty damning. It's more than pretty damning. It's quite devastating reading, actually. I'm going to have to jump around the YouTube algorithm a little bit for words because my channels are not that big that I can just throw words around without videos getting flagged. So forgive me, but I mean, no disrespect. But this was the national audit on group-based child sexual exploitation and abuse. So I'll call that the report from now on, and what happened, I will call it the abuse. This is pretty damning report. To me, it says that we've failed as a country. It says we have failed to protect the young white British girls of this country, systematically abused for many years, 500,000 children a year, and a whole list of things that follow. I'll come on to, I've read it. It's horrific, but I'll give you some broad bullet points, what I think. We are here on my Off the Record channel, so I will tell you what I think within the YouTube parameters. And I think that starts, so please do subscribe to this channel if you're new here. But I suppose it starts with the fact that the recent reasoned amendment to a bill that called for this inquiry, albeit it was tagging on the back of a bill, so it would have killed the bill, but it was a bit of a political stunt, so it's not entirely fair, but nonetheless, it did paint a clear picture. Not a single Labour MP voted in favour of that reasoned amendment, which would have said, well, it would have committed them to hold an inquiry. And not a single Labour MP voted for it. They all voted against. Now, not only do we have MPs saying that this is a far-right bandwagon, we've had MPs saying that it's a dog whistle and mudslinging and unnecessary, all of this sort of stuff. This report now makes it absolutely clear. This is absolutely what must happen. This is obviously why Keir Starmer has ordered this, to get ahead of this report. He obviously knew what was in the report. He obviously knew how it was going to make everybody look. And so he ordered the inquiry ahead of the release of this report, because otherwise it would be doubly damning. It's damning enough, but it would be doubly damning if, having refused to call an inquiry, having called it a far-right bandwagon, Lucy Powell calling it a dog whistle, and all of these sorts of things for so many months, and then this report drops like a sledgehammer to the British justice system, showing the scale and the devastation that has affected so many countless children. I can't use certain phrases because it will almost certainly get the video flagged, but there were certain phrases when I was growing up that I didn't understand to describe children that had, let's just call them, relations with groups of men. There were certain phrases that were bandied around. Being a child myself at the time, which is when I first heard this phrase, I didn't know what it meant. And you'll have to use your imagination. I can't say it on YouTube. I didn't know what it meant. And not until, obviously, a few years later, I realised what it meant. And you try to find out what happened in the justice system of all these things. And only years later, decades later now, we get this report which shows us the sheer scale of what had happened. And so to finish off what I was saying, the phrase that I didn't understand was bandied around essentially to blame those children for being in those relations. And obviously from reports and everything else have shown that they were blamed, victims were blamed, but it was not their fault. Often criminalized. One of the recommendations in this report is that they need to quash these convictions. Believe it or not, One of the recommendations is that they need to quash the convictions of these children who were not just victimized, they were literally criminalized whilst being abused. And one of the recommendations is that those convictions need to be quashed. Now, quite bluntly, ministers owe an apology, a full unequivocal apology. I'm not just talking about Labour, I'm talking about any minister, any person in any kind of authority, any kind of a system, department, service over the last decades owe an unequivocal apology to each and every one of these victims. But most of all, more recently, the ministers that have stood and fairly outspokenly condemned the idea of this inquiry that we now must do. They owe an apology. And not only that, we need to look at what their plan is, because I bookmarked something which I will look at here from Sarah Champion, who, by the way, obviously voted against the reasoned amendment, which would have signified intention to hold an inquiry. She voted against it as well. As I say, my full caveat, even though we're off the record, the full caveat is one of the valid reasons for voting against it would have been that it would kill the bill, and they wanted, the bill did other things. But still, it still sends a very powerful message. But she posted the following, and she called it her 5-point plan to ensure children are safeguarded, which in itself is inadequate. But I'll go through some of this as well. I'll put this on screen if I remember. Her 5-point plan, I'm not going to take long over this, but the first point, government to implement the inquiry recommendations from before with a timescale, ring-fenced resources, etc. Yeah, of course, all those things should have been done already. And it's not just any one person's fault that they've not been done. They need to be done. They should have been done already. But with this upcoming inquiry, there will doubtless be many more recommendations that they absolutely have to do. Her second point is really a question. Are they still happening? Are these grooming gangs still happening, or have cases been missed? And she says here, require, and I've got an issue with this, I'll tell you what it is in a minute. She says, require all local authorities and police to audit child protection referrals to this abuse over the last 10 years. And this would be UK-wide, and the results analysed by an independent panel. Areas would be given as standard canary questions, which would highlight areas of concern, etc. Now, my problem with this is as follows. Requiring the local authorities and the local police to audit themselves and self-refer. This report says that these problems were localized. They were systematically ignoring these problems. So how can that possibly be absolutely conclusive? That is surely quite a serious issue, because one of her plans is to ask them to self-report, self-audit and self-report. That's not adequate. It's like telling them to whistle blow on themselves. That's not adequate. Her third point in this plan, a national inquiry but locally led. Local inquiries don't have the power to compel witnesses, etc. as a statutory inquiry. But she says that it should be locally led, nationally resourced. Triggers would be victim and survivor reports, self-referral by local councils or police, or concern raised from an independent panel, and the findings and then fed back, etc. Now that has the same problem, because locally led, leaning on the local authorities or police or other bodies to self-report, is obviously not going to work. We would hope that it would work, but it obviously hasn't worked, because they've been systematically ignored for decades. Now, I'm going back at least till the 80s, early 80s, and reports suggest that it could have gone back even further, back into the 70s, but at least in the 80s, if not before. And so if it's been going on that long and it's been ignored for that long, the scale and systematic failures of the reporting and accountability of this has gone on for decades. Her fourth point, a new commission work into the motivations. Whilst we know about the crime, we do not know the reasons for the crime. Is it just power and opportunity? Is there something deeper we're failing to address? Now, I suppose you could say, on one hand, understanding the motives, you understand the criminal. And if you understand the criminal, you can preempt and prevent. Much like, I suppose, you understand the motives of a murderer, then you can prevent future murders because you spot the patterns of, do they look for trophies from victims? Do they, as in, murderers and whatever, you've seen the films and things. What do we look for to prevent this happening again? Her fifth point, review the law so that it's fit for purpose. That is one thing that is picked up by this report. Now, very briefly on this report, some of the broad areas, I'll probably go in greater detail on my main channel, Black Belt Barrister, but just in short here. Scale and data issues, around 500,000 children every year, but only 700 group-based cases recorded in 2023 due to poor data collection. So over 500,000 children experience this every single year, and yet only 700 group-based reports recorded in 2023 due to poor data collection, especially on the perpetrator ethnicity, hindering accurate assessment. Just poor reporting, poor recording. They were just not recording this data. The nature of the exploitation, and again, horrendous in the targeting, the socioeconomic status, the way that they did it. Again, there's only so much I can say on YouTube, otherwise the video will get flagged, but you can go and read it. Systematic failures, inconsistent definitions, poor information sharing, a lack of accountability in public institutions, the police, the children's services. You've seen reports, doubtless, where they've had an anti-racism person sitting in on one of these meetings, and therefore they've avoided questions on ethnicity. This is according to the report. They've avoided questions on ethnicity, obscured the problem, fueled mistrust and division, obviously from victims and victims' families and so on. Victim challenges. Most victims face long-term trauma, disbelief, re-traumatization by the justice system, usually misjudged as consenting adults. Of course, they were not. And levels upon levels of trauma and damage for these victims throughout this report. Recommendations: tighten up the laws that pertain to these offences for under 16s. One suggestion that there is no defence at all. Just make it strict. Improved data collection, especially on ethnicity, enhanced information sharing, closing taxi licensing loopholes, again read about it in the report, and pursuing justice for past failures to protect the victims and look back at those failures to look at what they can do. But the big takeaway from all of this is the sheer scale of systematic failure, right down to news reporters, right down to the reporting from companies, including the BBC. I saw this quoted this morning and I had to go and check that it is real and it is still there, it is still live. I'll put it on screen. You've obviously seen it if I remember to put it on screen. And just the attitude, the public attitude towards these victims using various phrases and terms which actually criminalize and stigmatize the victims in all of this. And the report says quite clearly we need an absolutely conclusive inquiry to absolutely make sure this is not just that it doesn't happen moving forwards, but that we look backwards and right those wrongs. Not just a little bit of outrage, a little bit of public fury, media fury, short-term government action, and then nothing more happens and the whole cycle repeats over and over again. This report is probably the worst testimony of the UK in decades, and that is what I really think. And I've only skim read it thus far. It's 197 pages long. It's available online. You can now go and find it yourself. So as I say, I've not read it in every word for word detail, but I've skim read it since it came out, and it's damning. That is what I really think. And so it's no wonder that Keir Starmer's ordered this inquiry, and now ministers are trying to jump on it to say, yes, this is absolutely the right thing to do, etc. Rachel Reeves saying, it's not about people being upset about, we didn't support it before. This is now about the victims. They don't get to say that. They don't get to say that, now it's the right thing to do. Now we're supporting it. Now we're moving forward. So, trust us, we've got this sort of attitude. That's not good enough. They need to all take accountability. And a lot of people need to be making apologies for not having done anything about this whenever they had the opportunity to do so. These are my genuine thoughts. We're here off the record. Please do subscribe to the new channel. A little bit more free to talk about what I really think. Thank you all so much for subscribing so far. Well over 50,000 now. Let's get that to 100,000 subscribers for the truth. Subscribe for the truth. Subscribe and vote with your feet. Thank you for watching. This is Black Belt Barrister off the record, signing off.